Welcome guys once again to the There's No Place Like Home for the Yugi-Days holiday special here on my channel. Today we're talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's, a favorite amongst fans of the franchise. I can't prove this, but I highly suspect that a lot of the decision making that went into creating Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's during the planning stage for the series came about because of the negative reaction to Yu-Gi-Oh! GX. 5D's is a significantly more serious series. It's set far in the future when, somehow, a new form of summoning monsters in the game of Duel Monsters has been discovered to produce energy. And so now a futuristic city uses that energy to sustain itself and become more and more prosperous, but there is a significant class divide and lower class members of society live in a slum district known as the Satellite, because it is literally separate from the rest of the city and kind of off to the side like a planet's moon would be, hence a satellite. And in Satellite, people are poor and hungry and don't have a lot of resources and are constantly harassed by security patrollers on motorcycles. And yes, this is the card games on motorcycles series. And our protagonist, Yusei Fudo, is actually from the Satellite. He has scrounged together a deck of cards which poetically is made up of scrap themed cards, because the Satellite is also like a big dump for scraps from the main city, and a D-Wheel, aka Duel Runner, one of the dueling motorcycles, and he plans to break out of the Satellite and earn a better life for himself and the other people there. Something that an old friend of him already did, Jack Atlas, who has become the dueling champion of the city, because of course that is the highest status that you can achieve. It's a dark and gritty world. It takes itself far more seriously, and I did enjoy this series, but I honestly like this one far less than some of the other spin-offs. Because while it does take itself more seriously, and while it does try to be more gritty and realistic and actually have a message to it, a message of the importance of equality and fighting for equality and working hard and all that nice stuff, it still keeps one of the silliest aspects of GX, and that is just how huge the card game of Duel Monsters is in this universe. Because it is set in the same universe, just further into the future. And so now there are these new kinds of monsters, synchro monsters, and there's this new type of dueling that is high speed and takes place on the back of these motorcycles, and so dueling is bigger than ever. And it's even more ridiculous than it was in GX when it was just a popular sporting event type of thing. Now the world almost revolves around it, and it just doesn't gel well with the ultra-realistic, gritty feel and level of seriousness that they're trying to present with this story. And I think that that's actually why, when the final arc of this story rolled around, the time travel arc that I mentioned in my review of Bonds Beyond Time, the show just completely lost me. The first major arc of the show, where there were actual villains and they actually had to fight for their lives, it was another magical threat type of thing. It was established back in the original series and reaffirmed in GX that Duel Monsters cards have souls, that they come to contain the real soul of whatever monster they depict, even if it's a monster imagined up by whoever created the card. That somehow when a duel monster is created, an actual corresponding monster, or I guess species of monster, comes into existence in the Duel Monsters dimension. And that card becomes a bridge between that dimension and ours. It's silly, but it's part of the lore, as is the magical history of the game. It is based on the original Shadow games played in ancient Egypt using monsters captured in stone tablets. And so there is an inherent magic to the game, a literal magic that people can use to have wizard duels with each other, for lack of a better term. So when a magical threat rolls out, sort of a group of dark counterparts to the main cast of heroes of this series, it's still pretty silly, but it fits with the lore of the franchise. Then the time travel thing rolls around and we find out that somehow Duel Monsters is going to cause the apocalypse. Now you've gone from Duel Monsters being a really popular game that inspired a really gifted tech genius to create holograms, to a game that is on par with a popular sporting event, to a game that has the potential to make you effectively king of a city, to a legitimate world-ending threat. The escalation there is just too much. And despite the fact that I do like time travel plots, and I did eventually go back and watch the rest of this, that's where I initially stopped watching the show. Now, if Yu-Gi-Oh! 5D's had just been a little bit more self-aware and hadn't taken itself quite as seriously, I think all of this stuff could have been really fun. Some of the plot lines of the next series, Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal, were equally overblown and escalated just as quickly, but because that show took itself less seriously and had more of a comedic lean, I actually think that the seriousness of those situations worked better there. Don't get me wrong, 5D's is a perfectly serviceable show, and fans of Yu-Gi-Oh! Have every right to like it as much as they do. The motorcycle duels, they're called, riding duels or turbo duels in the dub, are even, I think, pretty interesting. They had a different mechanic to them where you could only use certain types of spell cards, and you had to build up enough speed before you could use them, and that was really unique. And I did really like the characters. Yusei in particular was a really strong protagonist. Jack Atlas, his friend turned rival turned friend/rival, was a really fun Kaiba XP who to this day remains a fan favorite on par with Kaiba himself. But the series just tried too hard. Maybe you like that kind of thing. After all, one of the things that does draw a lot of people to Yu-Gi-Oh! Is how absurd it is, and this was definitely absurd. So if this is your kind of absurdness, good for you. But for me, 5D's is actually much lower on the list than pretty much any of these other shows. In fact, the more I think about it, it's probably bottom of the list for me. Again, not to say that it's a bad show, and not to say I didn't enjoy it, because I did. But if I were to rank these series, one of them would have to be on the bottom, and 5D's might be that series. But then again, it might not be, because as flawed as 5D's was, there is a series that is not only arguably more flawed, but just wasn't as good a series in general. So tune in next video to hear about that one, because the fun is just beginning.